Rajasar's discography is filled with so many orchestral masterpieces, and I want to take a look at one of them today, and the piece that I want to take a look at is the piece called How to Name It. How to Name It is such a stunning piece because it's something I would call like a musical round-trip journey. It starts in one place, goes all sorts of different places, but somehow manages to brilliantly find its way back home by ending where the song started. And there's so much to learn in how Rajasar crafts out this whole journey, and I want to explore a bit of that today. Now, pretty much all songs are journeys in a sense, right? Especially if you're familiar with the typical Pallavi Charnam format. Song starts with the Pallavi, goes to the Charnam, then comes back to the Pallavi, right? And that's a sort of loop journey that's created within the pattern itself. But what Rajasar crafts with How to Name It is quite a bit different, right? He crafts out this sort of insanely ambitious journey where he changes keys, changes ragams, changes textures, goes through a sort of structure of his own, yet somehow still manages to bind the song together by bringing the song back where it started towards the ending. And that sort of loop that he creates is absolutely stunning, and I think there's so much to explore and learn in how he crafts out this journey. So How to Name It goes through 4 separate distinct key changes. The song starts in C minor, then moves up to C sharp minor, then goes to E minor, then goes to C sharp minor with a hint of E major in there as well, then comes back home to C minor where the song started. Most of this video will be dedicated to figuring out how Rajasar makes these key changes work. 3 of the 4 key changes utilize a chord called the dominant chord, otherwise called the 5 chord. We've talked about this in previous videos as well, but the dominant chord can be a super useful tool when trying to conduct key changes. Throwing the dominant chord off your new key before going into that new key can really smoothen the key change process. This is because the 5 to 1 chord movement is a really common and natural chord movement, so putting the 5 chord off your new key before going into that new key can help smoothen the movement into your new key. Let me demonstrate through a simple example. Let's say we have a tune which is originally in the key of C major, and let's say midway we want to change keys to E major. You could just do that key change directly if you want. But sometimes that might sound a little bit forced, a little too sudden perhaps, right? With the transition not being smooth enough. So what you can do instead is use a dominant chord to help make that transition a little bit smoother. So if we're trying to move into E major, we throw in the 5 chord or dominant chord of E major before we go into E major. So the 5 chord or dominant chord of E major is B major. So right before we go into the new key of E major, let's throw in a B major chord. Now this process hopefully will sound a little bit smoother. Let's give it a listen. So hopefully you too felt that adding that dominant chord just made that transition a little bit smoother. And Rajasar uses this technique, using a dominant chord to smoothen out key changes. He does this in 3 out of the 4 key changes in How to Name It. And of course the way he does it has a lot more detail and finesse to it. So we're going to dissect all that right now one by one. So first, let's briefly listen to the 3 instances where he uses the dominant chord to facilitate a key change. So the first one happens when he moves from C minor to C sharp minor. He also does this when he's moving from C sharp minor to E minor. And finally, he also does this when we're returning back to our home key in C minor. So starting from the first key change goes from C minor to C sharp minor. So following the dominant chord technique that we talked about previously, this would mean that before going into C sharp minor, Raja sir would utilize the dominant chord or 5 chord of C sharp minor before going into that new key. So that sort of transition chord would be G sharp major, or you could say A flat major, right? Same thing. And in line with what we would expect, Raja sir uses an A flat 7 chord, right? That's just an A flat major chord with an additional 7th on top. But there is actually more to why this A flat 7 chord in particular works really well in serving as a bridge between the previous section and the section that is upcoming. If we look at the section before this whole transition, right? Basically the song up until this point. The song has been set to the key C minor, and specifically the ragam or the scale of Simendra Madhyamam, right? So if you look at Simendra Madhyamam in the key of C, it primarily uses the notes C, D, E flat, F sharp, G, A flat, and B. And now with that context in mind, if you look at the A flat 7 chord, which we're using as our transition, you notice that all of the notes of the A flat 7 chord actually fit perfectly in the framework of Simendra Madhyamam in C, right? So looking at the notes of A flat 7, it uses the notes A flat, C, E flat, F sharp, all present in the notes of Simendra Madhyamam in the key of C. So not only does this A flat 7 chord serve as a perfect setup for what is coming next, but it also fits the framework of what we've heard until this point. So it fits what has come before and it sets up what comes after. So it serves as a perfect bridge between what we've heard up until this point and what we're going to hear next, right? So it's just this perfect connecting tool. Incredible, right? But oh wait, we're not done talking about, the genius behind this key change. There's more. As impressive as what we've discussed earlier on is how Raja sir builds up to this chord, right? How he leads up to this chord. Listen to this whole melodic sequence that he builds as he leads up to this A flat 7 chord. Notice the pattern in the melody. Starting from the note G or the note Pa in a Carnatic framework, we are going up the notes bit by bit of the scale or the ragam Simendra Madhyamam. So since we started with G, if you look at the final note of the sequence that we would hit before repeating the note G an octave higher, it would be F sharp, right? Because if you go above F sharp, you just repeat the G again, right? So there's this journey that starts from the lower G or the lower Pa, and it slowly builds up to the highest note it can go before hitting the same note again. And that's Ma or F sharp, right? So this whole sequence is pa da pa ni pa sa pa ri, and so on and so forth, right? So this whole sequence, step by step, is just a dramatic buildup towards the note F sharp, which of course is part of the A flat 7 chord that we discussed earlier. And this whole dramatic build-up towards the A flat 7 chord makes this transition so engaging without sounding forced or unnatural. Now that we've discussed the first key change, let's listen to the second key change and discuss that. The second key change or second transition connects the section in C sharp minor with the next section in E minor. So using the whole dominant chord technique that we've been talking about, before we go into the section in E minor, we would throw in the dominant chord of E minor, which would be B major. Of course, like we saw with the first transition, the dominant chord used also fits into the framework of the previous section scale. Before the transition, so the previous section, we are in the key of C sharp minor, and specifically utilizing the notes of Raga Shanmugapriya. So that gives us the notes C sharp, D sharp, E, G, technically F double sharp, G sharp, A, and B. The key we want to transition into is E minor. So, think of the 5 chord of E minor, which is B major. B major has the notes B, D sharp, F sharp. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might notice that one of those notes is actually not in the raga of Shanmugapriya in the key of C sharp. That note is F sharp. And interestingly, it actually seems like Rajasar has not used the note F sharp in his B major chord, in that dominant chord that he plays. Instead, it seems like he only plays the B and the D sharp. And those two notes are enough to create the sort of B major sound, right? So with this version of the dominant chord, with just B and D sharp, it serves as the dominant chord of the next section in E minor, but it also still remains fitting to the previous section in C sharp Shanmugapriya. And so, thus once again, this chord, this dominant chord, serves as a wonderful bridge between the old section in C sharp Shanmugapriya and the next section in E minor. The way he builds up to this transition, though, is a little different to his approach to, the build-up of the first key change that we looked at previously. So with the first one, we saw that he created this whole melodic journey, right? Going up and down like a ladder, and then he was sort of aiming for this target note in his dominant chord, and then he sort of hit that chord, dramatically, right? And that whole journey was created through a melodic sort of journey. This time it's a little bit different. The journey seems to be more rhythmic than melodic. And, I don't know what specifically Rajasar was thinking, but I can sort of hypothesize and guess. Up until this point, the song has been very explorative in terms of melody and in terms of harmony. But in terms of rhythm, it's been quite limited. It's a rather slow song, and for the most part, it's been a sort of consistent 4/4 aditalam kind of thing. So at this point, perhaps Rajasar thought that there was scope to sort of go out of the song's comfort zone a little bit in terms of rhythm as well. And that's exactly what Rajasar does in the build-up towards the second transition, right? So at the point where, he's thinking of transitioning to the new section, he introduces this whole rhythmic shift, right? The mridangam comes in and it becomes this very sort of Carnatic, almost sort of Korve-like sequence, this sort of dramatic conclusion, and then right after that we hear the dominant chord. And as I mentioned, this section is quite a shake-up rhythmically, and it actually becomes quite difficult for the listener to keep up, right? And I think that's sort of the point. It's sort of meant to throw the listener off. Like, let's see if you can keep up. I struggled, to be honest. So I'm going to play that section with the mridangam. See if you're able to sort of keep tempo or keep talam. Now I'll show you where the downbeats lie with the metronome. So this rhythmic drama, this sort of taking the song out of its comfort zone in terms of rhythm, leads to a peak with the dominant chord with the B major, which then allows us to smoothly transition into the next section in E minor. So the two transitions we've looked at are both really cool in their own ways, right? One sort of utilized sort of melodic buildup, the other utilized a sort of rhythmic buildup, but both are using the dominant chord as a way to transition into the next section. So it's cool how both key changes are technically using the same technique, but are approaching it in two completely different ways. I'll skip the third key change for a moment and talk about the fourth key change, because the fourth key change also uses this dominant chord technique that we've been discussing until this point. So let's give that a listen. So once again, it's the power of the dominant chord, right? But this time it's not a regular dominant chord or even a small adjustment of the dominant chord. Raja Sir just really goes for it, and he really adds a lot of spice and drama to this chord while still maintaining the essence of the dominant chord. So if you look at the function of this dominant chord, what purpose it's supposed to serve, it's supposed to lead into the next section, the final section of the song, in C minor. So the chord we would expect before going into that section is its dominant, right? So G major. And the notes of G major are G, B, and D. And if we look at the dominant chord Raja Sir puts in, it does sort of maintain that essence, right? The bass is G, and we hear a B as well. It's what's around that which really adds the spice. So instead of a D, we hear a D sharp, which sort of gives it a sort of G augmented flavor rather than G major. And then on top of that, he adds a sort of G sharp note, and that makes it, I guess, technically a G augmented flat 9 or whatever. Like, the name is not important, but the point I'm trying to get across is while maintaining the essence of the dominant chord, he really adds a lot of tension. And even the way that the strings play that chord is filled with tension, right? So Raja Sir has them play it with a tremolo, right? So the players are sort of moving their bows really fast. And on top of that, they all crescendo together, right? Getting louder and louder, leading to this sort of climax, right? This sort of maximization of tension. And that's what really makes this chord so effective, so powerful, and which leads so nicely into the final section of the song. Now let me also touch on the third key change, which I skipped. Let's hear it once. This one is slightly more difficult to analyze because every recording I could find had a glitch in the sound right as the key change happens. But I think regardless of that, we can still analyze what's going on, but that's just a caveat to note. So there's no dominant chord here, right? So this key change utilizes a slightly different technique compared to the other key changes we've looked at. This key change actually utilizes maybe what you might think as common sense. It's not some, super complicated music theory thing, but it utilizes the power of repetition, right? And repetition is such a powerful tool because if you repeat something so many times, it builds a sense of anticipation. If you repeat something so many times, at some point the listener will realize that, oh my gosh, this is repeating, this keeps on going, right? Like, when is it going to change? Right? That question will inevitably come into the listener's mind. So that's a way to engage the listener and a way to make them anticipate a certain change. So if you're looking to change keys, one way to do it, as Raja Sir has done here, is to repeat a phrase many times, build a sense of anticipation, which helps set up the listener's mind for the upcoming key change. And that allows you to execute the key change a bit more smoothly. And these aren't just plain repetitions, right? Each string part does play the same line, but they start at different points. So the combination of all these parts creates this sort of overlapping, you could even say a sort of contrapuntal effect. And, the combination of all these parts almost feels like a maze, right? All these overlapping parts feels a little bit confusing, but they also come together, really harmoniously. And, this unique form of repetition, one that engages the power of repetition, but does so in an interesting way, builds a sense of anticipation and helps anticipate a sort of change that's about to happen, helps sort of the listeners expect a sort of change. And that's what helps set up the key change and allows the transition of sections to happen smoothly. There's so much more to discuss with this composition, but what I want to focus on was how Raja Sir builds this round trip journey, how he transitions so brilliantly from section to section. So hopefully you found this video insightful in that sense. But because there's so much more to discuss, I would really recommend all of you to listen to the full song. And to actually help you discover more, I created a full transcription of all of the parts in the song, at least to the best of my abilities. Of course, I won't be 100% accurate, but I've tried my best. I spent a lot of time on it. So, I've created a full transcription. So do listen to the song, and if it might be helpful, use my transcription where I've written, the notes of all of the parts. Use that as a sort of visual aid. And I think when you do that, and potentially with the help of the visual transcription as well, you'll discover a lot of really cool things about this really incredible composition, and that will fascinate you and interest you and allow you to dig deeper even more. So yeah, with regards to video, that's that, and I really hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you so much.